or 6. We're going to be looking at Amos 6 verses 1 through 14, called The Fearful Solemnity of Spiritual Air. Don't get too excited about that. It's a mouthful, but it just simply means it's a solemn event when you find spiritual error. Well, let's consider the charges that have been leveled against Judah and against Israel to this point in Amos, and then think about how our culture compares to these things. I'm going to read the list. It'll be rather quick because it's a rather long list. They rejected the law of the Lord. They had not kept his statutes. They were idolatrous. They had pride in their false worship. They were religious, but thoroughly unacceptable was their religion. Their worship, at least, was thoroughly unacceptable to God. They gained wealth by oppression of the poor and the helpless. Remember, Amos is speaking primarily to those rich, wealthy, and elite members. They undertook intimidation of those who were righteous. They meted out injustice in the courts. They bought their verdicts, it would seem. They brought tumult and social unrest. They lived in unrighteousness. They even lived in drunkenness. They engaged in gross sexual immorality, spent their money on opulence and waste. They no longer knew what was right. That was the major one, perhaps. They were steadfastly complacent. They were unresponsive to divine discipline, and they stopped the mouths of the prophets. Pretty long list. In chapter 6 now, we're going to look at God's other arguments, his fifth argument in particular, and we're going to find many things in this spiritual corruption. They were blinded. Israel was blinded by national pride and self-assurance. They had economic and military might, and so they were happy with that and depended upon it to do their bidding. They were characterized by self-indulgence, that's the rich, of course, given to gluttony, created and made sacrilegious music, there's an interesting one, and they lived in denial of how things really are. And remember, anyone involved in idolatry is living in denial of how things really are. From our last session, we learned that sincerity and ceremony don't cut it with God. It takes truth. And you can remember in John 4:23, Jesus told the woman at the well that God wanted people who worshiped him in spirit and in truth. In other words, obedience is required. In the first 7 verses, Amos described again the affluence and the arrogance of the northern kingdom and our culture as well. But Amos soon marked those attitudes as incredible folly. He repeated that same message throughout chapters 3 through 6. The message, there will be retribution for evil deeds. Evil will not go unpunished. Amos began chapter 6 by speaking directly to these influential elite. That's really who he's been talking to the whole time. But these were guys that must have been in the upper echelon because they are said to have given advice, counsel, and legal opinions to the people of lands that were or had been vassals of the northern kingdom. In other words, they thought they were really something. They were the best in the region, so they thought. And so they were giving out advice to the people of those nations. Uh, when we start in verse 6, chapter 6, verse 1, we're going to probably, at least I think, there's a bit of sarcasm. Amos is going to offer a woe, the opposite of blessing, of course, something you don't want to hear someone warn you about. Amos 6:1, woe to you who are complacent, that means at ease, in Zion, now he's talking to Jerusalem, and to you who feel secure on Mount Samaria. Samaria was a city on a high hill, and so it felt like it was well fortified. So we're talking both to Judah and Israel here. It says, you notable men of the foremost nation to whom the people come. Woe to those guys, he's saying. With reference to Zion, of course, he's given notice that Judah is included in the warning of this particular woe. How highly did these leaders think of themselves? Well, it appears as though that to the point of arrogance. They were influential, considered themselves the top men of the top nation. Pride was evident. And as it turns out, it's unreal pride. Part of Israel's problem was misplaced confidence in their privileges and preeminence above other nations. Israel as a nation was vainly conceited, particularly at the upper levels, and their optimism, however, was true folly. Now, we're going to look at 3 city-states that are focused in the next 2 verses of chapter 6. But each of these 3, and this is where the sarcasm, I think, comes in, each of these 3 had been or would be overrun, and they were submitted for comparison to Israel, here considered as a city who thought too much of themselves. Well, let's look at that. Let's look at verses 2 and 3 of chapter 6. I get my tongue moving again, maybe in the right direction. Go to Calneh, C-A-L-N-E-H. That's a city in far northern Syria, and it was taken over by the Assyrians at some point. And then go down, and go to Calneh and look at it. Go from there to Great Hamath, H-A-M-A-T-H. Again, another town that considered itself great, far north of Damascus, where Assyria had again taken them captive, but they still thought they were something special, apparently. And then go down to Gath in Philistia. Gath was one of the 5 major cities in Philistia. Goliath's hometown. And here's the question that is asked of those 3 cities. Are those 3 cities, better off than your 2 kingdoms, that be Israel and Judah? Is their land larger than yours? You put off, and here's a charge, you put off the evil day and bring near a reign of terror. Well, as we said, Calneh and Hamath, both of them, by the way, their meaning means fortress. They were in northern Syria. They were overrun by Assyria 80 or 90 years before Amos. And they would be destroyed, as a matter of fact, 2 or 3 years after the fall of Samaria. Samaria is going to fall, another 30, 35 years after Amos. And a couple of years after that, Calneh and Hamath will be totally destroyed. Hamath again considered itself great, even though it was a vassal state of Assyria at the time. And Gath, as we mentioned, was one of the 5 major cities, a home of Goliath. And interestingly, Gath had been twice devastated, once by Syria, once by Judah. Well, these 2 verses are open to a couple of different interpretations. I'll give you what they are. You may deal with them as you see fit. Amos, the first one says Amos was parroting Samaritan propaganda, which showed Israel's self-assurance and pride as if they're boasting, those other 3 don't hold a candle to Israel and her power. We're greater in all respects than those 3 city-states are. But the second one says, nah, this is God's put down. Here's where the sarcasm would come in. It's as if the verses were saying, was Israel any better prepared to fight off Assyria than were Calneh and Hamath and Gath? Obviously not. Did those 3 have larger boundaries than Samaria? You bet they did. So who do you think you are? How did Israel respond to Amos? She scornfully dismissed all thoughts of calamity and military defeat. She denied reality. But Amos said that state of denial only brought terror and destruction that much closer. Just to give you an example, about 8 or 12 years later, Israel had 6 kings in a span of 31 years. 3 of them were assassinated. You can find that in 2 Kings 15 if you wish to check it out. When God speaks in His Word, keep in mind that it's going to happen. You can be sure of it. As evidence of that fact, let me read you some from Isaiah 10. It's going to be a deal about the king of Assyria, who is going to claim that Samaria and Jerusalem were second-rate states. And this was somewhere after 722 BC, after Samaria had already been defeated by the king of Assyria, and he was looking to defeat Judah in Jerusalem in particular. And the time when their army, a massive army, was established and marching on Jerusalem, these are the words that Isaiah puts in the mouth of the king of Assyria one night while he was walking around the walls of Jerusalem, or at least standing at the wall of Jerusalem, challenging the people about their second-class status. And here's what the king of Assyria is said to have said. Has not Calno, which we believe is the same as Calneh, the city that we'd spoken of earlier, has not Calneh fared like Carchemish? Is not Hamath like Arpad? And Samaria like Damascus? Assyria had run over all of those places and run them down, and they became vassal states. Verse 10, as my hand, this is the king of Assyria speaking, sees the kingdoms of the idols, kingdoms whose images excelled those of Jerusalem and Samaria, put down. Verse 11, shall I not deal with Jerusalem and her images as I dealt with Samaria and her idols? He was using that to tell them, look, your God's not going to get in the way of Baal. My God, I'm going to wipe you guys out, just like I wiped out Samaria and at least defeated Samaria. Verse 12, when the Lord has finished all of his work against Mount Zion and Jerusalem, he will say, I will punish the king of Assyria. Now it's Isaiah putting words in God's mouth. When the Lord has finished all of his work against Mount Zion and Jerusalem, so this is part of God's judgment of Jerusalem, he will say, I will punish the king of Assyria for the willful pride in his heart and the haughty look in his eyes. Interestingly, that's exactly what Amos has been accusing Israel of also. What was that? Willful pride in his heart and a haughty look in his eyes. Now, of course, Assyria never conquered Jerusalem, but it was defeated later by Babylon and Medo-Persia. But, interestingly, I get rid of this here in a bit. Interestingly, Assyria was never able to defeat Jerusalem either. They walked away. Why? Well, if you read it in 2 Kings 19, 35 and 36, you'll find a story we've been over in this series before. That one night, the angel of the Lord, the angel of Jehovah, one we have called Malach Yahweh, went out and put to death 185,000 men of the Assyrian camp. 185,000 soldiers. When the people got up the next morning, there were all the dead bodies. So Sennacherib, king of Assyria, broke camp and withdrew. He ran. He returned to Nineveh and stayed there, where, incidentally, not long after that, he was assassinated by two of his sons who wanted power, evidently. So the seeds of disaster are always present in every nation, present in every church, present in every individual. Let me ask you a question about our culture. Has our culture in America relegated the church to the status of a second-class institution? Remember, that's what Sennacherib was calling Samaria and Jerusalem, second class. Well, has our culture done that to us? Well, next, going to verse 4, 5, and 6, Amos amplified the life of the affluent. He highlighted it. And he highlighted three sins that are known to bring nations down. Here they are: gluttony and self-indulgence. Sacrilegious music, would you believe that that is part of bringing a nation down? Drunkenness. So let's read Amos 4 through 6. I'm going to insert some counts here, like up to 5, 6, or 7. We'll see. Amos, this is God speaking, or Amos speaking, I forget which at this point. Either way, Amos is speaking for God. You, and here's the first one, lie on beds inlaid with ivory. That implies, of course, opulence and waste. You don't need ivory on your bed, inlaid. Secondly, you lounge. In this case, the word implies you loll around, sprawl drunkenly on your couches, which you remember earlier, Amos spoke of those couches as expensive couches, also luxury all the way. Third, you dine on choice lambs and fattened calves. What's the big deal about that? Well, the average person seldom had meat in Israel in that day. And these guys were dining on the choice lambs and fatted calves, the young tender meat, USDA choice. And the fourth charge, you strum away on your harps like David. And fifth, you improvise on musical instruments. Sixth, you drink wine by the bowlful, not the cupful, not the glassful, by the bowlful. And by the way, those bowlfuls were supposedly sacred bowls used in worship. And finally, number 7, the seventh charge, you use the finest lotions. I guess you want to have smooth skin, smell good, something like that. But here is the ending of that list. But you do not grieve over the ruin, that is a breakdown, of Joseph. And here he's using Joseph as a synonym for the northern kingdom. And it is interesting because, excuse me, in trying to imitate David's musical efforts, these people were likely mocking sacrilegious music in some way, or they were perhaps, or they not were mocking, they were making sacrilegious music, and they were mocking the religious songs, or even performing erotic dances. We don't know everything that was involved there. But this isn't the first time Amos has said that. Back in 523, Amos said, "Away with your noise of your songs." This was supposedly God speaking. "I will not listen to the music of your harps." So how much were they drinking? Well, to excess. Not by the glassful, not by the cupful, but by the bowlful. Again, Amos had said something similar to this earlier. They, that is the rich, lie down beside every altar on garments taken in pledge, and that was not to be done. You weren't to keep garments that people needed to stay warm with at night. You had to give it back to them at night. But they lied down, going to sleep on garments, not under, but on garments illegally taken as pledge. In the house of their God, they drink wine taken as fines. So they were even boozing it up in their temples by wine taken by some kind of force, fraud, whatever it was. Remember, they were oppressing the poor. Well, we said they like to smell good, apparently, and have soft skin. But, God doesn't take everything that they were doing as having any particular value. God places moral and spiritual considerations above all of those things. And there they came up short. The charge, it seems to be the final straw. That was the last portion of the verse that we read. The breakup of your own nation, he said, is of no concern to you so long as your personal peace and your affluence are not affected. In other words, as long as these top characters were still fat, dumb, and happy, didn't matter what was happening to the country. It'd be a sad day if in this country the church was silent while the nation increased in godliness. In the early 70s, Francis Schaeffer predicted these things for America, and I'll read you a brief passage from there. He said, "I believe the majority of the silent majority," that's supposedly a moral silent majority, "young and old, will sustain the loss of liberties," they'll put up with it, "without raising their voices as long as their own lifestyles are not threatened." He's talking about us, folks. Politicians know that voices will not be raised as long as people have personal peace and affluence, or at least an illusion of them. Just, by the way, I'm thinking back to that reference to Joseph, calling Northern Kingdom by the name Joseph. Where he was saying, you're sitting there fat, dumb, and happy while your nation's breaking up and you don't really care. Well, if you go back and look in Genesis 33 or 37, you will find that when Joseph's brother threw him in the pit and sold him to the Ishmaelites as a slave, when they threw him in the pit, he was going crazy, begging for his life, I suspect. And they sat down to eat their meal, undisturbed. And then in 42:21 in Genesis, these are the brothers, once they've confronted their situation in Joseph, they said to one another, "Surely we are being punished because of our brother. We saw how distressed he was when he pleaded with us for his life while he was in the pit. But we would not listen. That's why this distress has come upon us." So God has said, you guys, while he called their nation Joseph, he was reminding them that Joseph's brothers acted in exactly the same way the fat cats are acting. Well, the patriarchs took their pleasures, as we said, while Joseph was there. But do you know that mirth in the time that should be mourning is a sin? I'll let you read that in Isaiah 22. I will read only verse 14 of that chapter. And he's been talking about their being fat, dumb, and happy when they should be mourning. Verse 14, the Lord Almighty has revealed this in my hearing. And here's what was revealed. Till your dying day, this sin will not be atoned for, says the Lord Almighty. And verse 7 of Amos, therefore, because of the three categories of sin, we talked about it before, therefore, you, that's the influential of Israel, therefore you will be among the first to go into exile. That's kind of a cute thing because first and foremost come from the same root. So if you go back and read Amos 6, 1 and 7 together, it goes something like this. Woe to you who are complacent in Zion, and to you who feel secure on Mount Samaria, you notable men of the foremost nation, to whom the people of Israel come. You will be among the first to go into exile. Your feasting and lounging will end. Here's the way I would write that. I would replace notable, top, and first and foremost by the word top. You top men of the top nation will be at the top of the exile list. Let me give you a few takeaways. When God makes a list of charges, it's going to generally be long. When God brings charges to bring about repentance, that's the only reason he does it. Peace, comfort, luxury, and success carry the danger of pride and self-assurance by replacing dependence on God. Every believer should have a serious concern for the state of his nation, and that includes us. Leaders in the church may be the first to be tested and disciplined. In our next session, we're going to finish this fifth argument, supporting God's judgment of Israel's judgment. And it's going to be an argument that the nation was grossly corrupt spiritually. I'll see you then. Thank you.